Both? Okay, I've got a double mic.
There we go.
Okay. And how do where's the clicker? Is this it? Can everyone hear me? Great. No? Are we on? I have two of these, so one of them should work. Turn it on. I guess it helps if you turn on. Can everyone hear me now? Great, thanks. And is there a clicker? Oh, there it is.
It won't work on yours. You'll have to use it.
Oh, it won't work on a Mac. Okay.
No, you just not connected. It's connected.
Oh, okay. That's fine. I can deal. All right. All right. Thanks a lot, Kathy, for that introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I think it's a great topic for a symposium, and I'm just delighted that I can be here with Martha Farah, Greg Burns, and Julie Seaman is going to be doing the panel discussion. So let me just jump right into it because Greg did a wonderful job of setting up fMRI and the kinds of things that we look at with fMRI. And let's see if I have a laser pointer. Can I borrow your laser pointer, Greg? Do you have a laser pointer? Tell you what, I'll just use a cursor for right now. Okay, but if you do happen to find a laser pointer, that'd be fine. So, all right, so now we're going from the sacred to perhaps the profane. I really have only one goal today, and I'll try. Thanks a lot. Oh, I pressed the top? Okay, it's on the wrist. Okay. So, my one goal today, which I hope to accomplish, I'm not much of a multitasker. I'm not one of those super multitaskers you might have heard of, is really to combine this equation and come up with this. So, I'd like to discuss some neuroethical issues with a few select illustrations from my own research and those of others in related fields, and try to get the neuroethical juices flowing, so to speak. And so, for the topics that I'm going to be discussing, we sort of have the opposite issue that Greg had. It's not national security. It really is, a lot of people's main reaction is you get paid to study that, and why are we using taxpayer dollars? It's an ethical issue. We have recession, so why are you using this very expensive technology, using medical devices to try to look at some issues that some people think may not be ones we really should be using those resources on? And I'll leave it up to you for this ethical dilemma here about where to spend the money. But to try to, so I won't talk about, obviously because we're doing this kind of research, we feel it's important, and I'll give you some reasons why, specific reasons, has clinical implications, for example. But I wanted to take, I came across this as I was just looking through a very recent article, and there's this fellow who does, if anything, something which is maybe harder to justify to the media. And so what he does is he studies not just reactions of the brain to visual sexual stimuli, but he actually has individuals in a scanner engaging in sexual activity. So he particularly looks at sexual function in females, and here's the obligatory press comment here that's a little bit snarky, if you can see that in the back. So you think, oh, okay, well, why are we spending money on this? This guy must be having some problems. There must be no reason. Why would you ever look at this? What's social value? You may not be able to read this, but I thought I knew this guy's work, but I didn't realize the backstory of this, which turned out that he had worked with rats and found that there was analgesic effect that was sort of evident, a pain-blocking response during sexual activity, and his wife was diagnosed with breast cancer and was in extreme pain, and this motivated him to use his research and go into this line of research. And in fact, they have been finding it to be efficacious in some cases. So maybe something will come from that. So I think the moral of the story really is that the research on these socially relevant issues just sort of draws out all of these criticisms from everywhere. It's based on the topic and not really the scientific merit, because I think everybody would agree that pain alleviation is a very worthy goal. This is that Golden Fleece Award. And so even these most criticized studies have advanced our knowledge of various things like reproduction, which of course is very important. Try having your species not do that for about 90 years and see where you get. So I think at least that's an existence proof that it could be important to look at this. So let me jump now to a few key points. So what I'm going to try to do is just touch on some key points of neuroethics as they relate to neuroimaging. And I'm going to give you a little bit of politics and a lot more of sexual behavior. Everyone said, give me more sex in the talk. So I'll have that at the end to keep everyone here. And then I'll have a little discussion and summary. So I think the question of what we should do with fMRI really depends on what we really can do, that is what fMRI can help in terms of getting the answer to. And that actually is often quite different from what the public or even other scientists think it can do. I think there's a disconnect that often happens between the scientists that are reporting the information, the people in the media, and the public. And I don't think it's necessarily malevolent. I just think it's sort of human nature in a sense. So just to kind of get this idea in your mind, this is kind of how I think of things, is that if you're a neuroscientist who has some fMRI results like on sacred values, and you then want to disseminate this to the public at large, you go through the media. Putting it up on the website's good, but generally people put it in the media. And the media have various biases, which I think they get from other types of reporting. They tend to oversimplify, the limitations of research is downplayed, and that there's this idea that people have that because it's in the brain, because there's an image, that it's immutable. And not to bash the media, I think some do a very good job, and I actually have two very short clips today of some science reporting which I think does better than average job. And I wanted to focus on three things that neuroimaging can do vis-a-vis these neuroethical issues. So, well, when we have a neuroimaging study, most of them are involved in trying to understand something about human behavior, psychology, for example. But as Greg was showing very interestingly, you can also use it to, this understanding can be used to predict behavior of individuals or groups. And then the next stage is to control that behavior. I'm not quite sure it really works linearly like this, but I think you might find that if you actually go and try to influence something in some person, that might carry some additional ethical baggage with it. So another issue that I want to just touch on briefly before jumping into the research is this issue of, well, what can we make from neuroimaging? So a typical fMRI study will say, well, let's look at what areas of the brain are involved in hearing. So you'll play them tones, various things that are not tones, silence, and you might get some areas in the temporal lobe, and that's basically your typical fMRI study circa 1995. However, when we get into some of these social issues, often what we're trying to do is use the fMRI data, all these activated brain regions that you were seeing, for example, in Greg's talk, to make an inference backwards, actually, which is an inference about the psychological processes, such as the anterior cingulate cortex involved in conflict resolution. So maybe you see when people are in the sacred values trying to decide, you see it more active. Well, based on other studies, you see sometimes it's active during conflict, but also other things like working memory. So it's a bit of a sort of skating on thin ice, sometimes thinner, sometimes thicker. It really depends on exactly how you do this reverse inference. So I don't want to make you think that it's wrong always, but it can often be more difficult to justify. And since I was interested in tea leaves, I actually looked it up, and it's more complicated than you think. There's actually a whole ritual, and there are manuals on how to do this, if you see this. So it's sort of interesting that actually if you read through this, a lot of the same ways they interpret tea leaves in terms of looking at groups rather than individuals apply to fMRI. So maybe we haven't come all that far. And there is this human, I don't know if you can see from the back, but if you look deeply in here, I think you might see something related to a sacred value. The reason I point this out is that humans have this natural tendency to see order even when there is none. For example, I think there was a bagel that had the Virgin Mary supposedly on it that was sold on eBay for a lot of money. So I think that connects up to your sacred values nicely. Okay, with those ideas firmly in your working memory, let me jump into a little bit of politics in fMRI. And one of the major sort of impetuses of the discussion about the neuroethical implications of this kind of research was a study that was reported in the New York Times, or at least it was excerpted in the New York Times. And Martha Farah actually had a very interesting and thoughtful commentary about this. And rather than go through what they did, I'll just kind of summarize it. So basically, this was before the 2008 election. Iacoboni and colleagues were showing various people in their scanner pictures of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and different candidates. And basically what they're trying to do is this reverse inference. They were trying to read from the pattern of activation in their subjects' minds what was going on. Like, was someone sexually aroused by Hillary Clinton, for example, or were they threatened by her power? So there were a lot of, so things like this, where the Democrat brain and Republican brain. And I don't want to say that it's all hogwash. I think we just don't really know. I think that would be fine if you wanted to just have sort of an exploratory spirit. Say, hey, this is a great way to get some new hypotheses, and let's look at it in a more sort of controlled way. But I think we'd all agree that there are multiple reasons why a particular part of the brain might be active. So that it really is jumping the gun to say that one particular pattern means that, that means that you don't want to vote for Hillary Clinton for this reason. Or if she cried, then that would make you vote for her, something like that. And so, again, a little bit of the levity here in the afternoon. But, what we're not trying to do is develop some kind of phrenology like this. However, it is important to realize that we can get some information about what these areas have been done with in the past. Yeah, it's amazing what people can think about here. Okay, so let me jump into some actual data, again, really briefly, because I'll spend more time on sex, as I was requested to do. So this was a study that was done in collaboration with Drew Weston, Clint Kiltz in psychiatry, and I'll mention the others in a moment. And the basic idea was that we were going to look at, this was before the 2004 election, so this was a long time ago, and we were interested in this issue of the interaction between reason and emotion. And the classical view that you might be familiar with from the Greeks is that rational decisions really should be not swayed by any kind of empathy or some kind of some emotion, because that's just going to get it messed up. So, Mr. Spock there is good at chess because of that. A more recent view, but actually if you go back into history, it has popped up from time to time, is that actually emotion can sometimes be good. It can increase your confidence in something, or you can be faster. It can help you very quickly narrow down alternatives. So Antonio Damasio is probably one of the best known advocates of this position. So we want to look specifically at the neural basis of motivated reasoning. We thought this was a great way to look at it. We had a scramble, though, before the 2004 election, so I have to give a shout out to the Emory College seed grant fund. They gave us all this money at a moment's notice, and then we were able to run these people all before the election. I think we did the entire study in about 2 months from preparation to finishing it. And then it took us several years to write it up, as is usual. And these kind of things. So we wanted to look at what happens to logical reasoning when you have some sort of investment in the outcome. Because people had already looked at sort of modus tollens type of non-emotional reasoning. And so what we did is we presented subjects with contradictions. So we had partisan Democrats and partisan Republicans, and we presented them with contradictory information that was actually uttered by their candidate, and we sort of probed it in different ways, as you'll see in this very short video. But the thing to note here is when we actually asked these people, so these were, for example, this is a contradiction. George Bush said something that was then contradicted, and it sort of is just contradictory. No two ways around it. But if you're a Republican, very strongly Republican, you rate it as a 2 in terms of how contradictory it was. But if you're a Democrat, you rate it much higher. And of course, it reversed as you go to there. And then we also had contradictions that were uttered by people that nobody really cared about. Just people they knew, but they really had nothing to do with the Democrat or Republican. So that was the basic behavioral finding. And then we wanted to see, well, what can we see in the brain that might relate to that? And if this works, I will be very happy. So this is a very short video that I think gives you a great idea of what it's like to go through one of these studies if you've never been through it. It's only about 2 minutes. So I hope you can hear it. Can you hear that?
The 2004 presidential campaign pitting President Bush against John Kerry. Lead researcher Drew Weston says the study found emotions ruled over facts, and the partisans were faced with contradictory statements made by their candidates.
And the remarkable thing was that the brain found a way to deny contradiction.
To see how the research was conducted, I agreed to have my head examined, just like the study participants. You all set? There we go. Inside an MRI machine, I was shown statements attributed to Bush and Kerry. After each statement, another slide showed how the candidate later contradicted himself, suggesting he was less than honest. Then, a slide asked participants to push buttons to register how contradictory the statements were. The findings? Well, Kerry supporters had no trouble recognizing the Bush contradictions and vice versa. But when partisans were confronted with inconsistent statements from their own candidates, brain circuits involving distress, emotional conflict, and memory retrieval fired up.
So it looked like this part of the brain, these emotion centers, are recruiting memories and essentially twirling the cognitive kaleidoscope until the brain could find the solution to the problem and would be non-threatening.
The researchers also found that after the participants rationalized away the contradiction, the brain's pleasure circuits lit up, a sort of political high. But through all of this, circuits governing logic and reason never fired. Weston says these findings are good news for the Republican Party.
They are much more sophisticated in understanding how an emotion-driven mind works. Republicans understand that if you want to win, you win in the marketplace of emotions. And the Democrats keep trying to appeal to the facts and evidence. And it doesn't really.
So, I always like the way Drew, he's got a way with words, the cognitive kaleidoscope. So I wanted to go back to those three uses of fMRI and just kind of briefly maybe bring some ideas to mind that we can talk about later. So, so what's the point of this study? What could we possibly gain from this? Well, we can understand better how emotion and cognition interact in the context of politics, and understand how people think about groups and cognitive dissonance. This has been a big issue in social psychology for decades. It can also perhaps raise self-awareness of our own cognitive biases. So if you're a strongly partisan person, maybe learning something about these very strong brain-based effects might help you eventually sort of liberate yourself from it. But at the same time, as you probably picked up, there was a hint of this strong reverse inference. As I said, we don't really know that those particular activations meant that. It's just based on our prior evidence, we had some reason to believe that. So we might be risking, or I think we probably are risking, exaggerating the ability to interpret these activations just sort of beyond what we really can, tea leaf reading. So let's then move to prediction. So let's say if you wanted to move towards neuromarketing plus politics, I think, Greg, have people been using neuromarketing with a lot of politics in the United States, or? Oh, okay. Oh, they've actually gone. Okay, so Jacoboni and et al. Have been using this. The idea is that you want to, in neuromarketing, you're trying to use the fMRI data to eventually change voter opinions by predicting it. We can predict response to conflicting information. But let me pose this sort of Orwellian scenario. Perhaps by using this, we could detect individuals who hold hidden, forbidden beliefs. Well, wait, you just said that. I can't say it's Orwellian then. Forbidden beliefs or are disloyal. That is, things like they want to do horrible things, but you can't see that. Or we could even go further and say detect individuals who will do this in the future. So that might have some ethical qualms associated with it. And now if we want to control people's behavior, we could use neuromarketing to change their behavior. You could, on the other hand, counter your biases, so that would be a good thing. But I think one of the other problems is using neuromarketing to sort of fiddle with voter behavior and ads. That sort of puts in some kind of unforeseeable variable, and I'm not sure we're all happy with sort of fiddling with our political system that way. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about politics. I guess I'm already thinking about sex here. So why should sex and politics be connected? I really don't have any answer to that. I guess in the news sometimes it is. But actually, as you'll see, there's some of the areas of the brain that are active in terms of reward that actually are coactive. So I want to tell you a little bit about some research we've done. on sex differences, which is always a hot button topic. I think we're all familiar with some public figures who've gotten into hot water for making some statements about math ability, perhaps, or other things. Yeah, again, people just have a lot of fun putting these things in here. The person must have actually known something about neuroscience, because there's actually some stuff about, yeah, well, you can probably figure it out from here. So obviously that's not what we want to do, but what we did want to do was, we're really interested in this sex difference. We did other work on sex differences and emotional memory, for example, and emotional stimuli. So we viewed this as an outgrowth of that. So one of the big sex differences is really that men, if you've ever turned off the filter on your Google for the extreme stuff, you'll see that a lot of stuff is aimed towards men, sexually arousing material, and there's a lot of psychological evidence that backs that up. So basically, it's a very large difference. I mean, if you look out there on a lot of different measures in terms of people seeking this type of stuff out in various ways, there's a large behavioral difference. There's also various accounts of why there's a difference between men and women in terms of men's preoccupation with these visual stimuli. One idea is that males who, in some previous time, failed to be rapidly aroused by visual sexual signals and mate with females would be less likely to pass on their genes. So, they have a good opportunity. So this guy here wins out because you probably can't see it. This is from like a 1920s cartoon here. He's looking at an exposed leg. And this hapless individual is walking right by, and he won't propagate his genes. So, and then, of course, this is a caricature of all these accounts in one sense. There's another view that basically it's really socialization, so that it's not that there's anything biological about it per se, it's just that there's this strong cultural tendency to have men and women view each other in different ways. And I just wanted to point out, there's really no reason to suppose that these views are incompatible. I think sometimes they're portrayed that way incorrectly in the media, because we can easily think about various kinds of evolutionarily shaped biases that can be modified by various kinds of experience or culture. So, okay, so I got to justify why we did this. Well, it's a psychologically important difference between men and women, but very little was known about the neurobiological basis of this. It could shed light on the brain basis of other sex differences. So, for example, maybe the same areas that are involved in these sex differences might also be involved in others. And there's actually clinical implications, because there are various kinds of clinical disorders which involve sexual arousal, either inappropriate sexual arousal or hypoarousal. So, and there's also an animal component to this. So the literature on the amygdala and appetitive sexual behavior actually shows a striking difference between male rats and female rats in terms of the medial amygdala's role in this precopulatory behavior. So I have to explain this a little bit. So it's kind of an ingenious thing. There's a female rat you can't see here, which is on a plexiglass plate, and she will drop down if this male rat here presses that lever enough. So his rate of pressing the lever is sort of a way of measuring his desire. And then there's copulatory activity there. But what's interesting is if you take out the medial amygdala in the rat, it'll affect the former but not the latter. So I'm not saying that adult males we're not rats, but there could be some conservation of these. Like, for example, as Larry Young has shown in terms of pair bonding systems. So again, here's a very short video, which I might even cut.
One psychologist in Atlanta has made it his mission to find out. Take a look. series of 200 pictures ranging from overtly sexual to completely non-sexual, all the while monitoring their brain activity.
Are you ready? All right, so when you see the pictures, just think whether thoughts or feel whether feelings come into your mind. Okay, just watch what I think we need.
Beautiful.
It looks big and masculine.
As Kevin is bombarded with images, the functional MRI measures the blood flow to different.
Going at any given time. Where is brighter in this image here, there was more activity.
Hey, Kevin, how was it? You like it? Yeah. Can I go back? Next, it's Hadley's time. Sexual imagery. Kevin followed the typical male pattern. The sexual center of his brain was immediately and intensely activated by overtly sexual photos, and his emotional centers were also activated. Like Kevin, Hadley's brain patterns also showed levels of arousal. While Hadley's brain patterns were similar to Kevin, they were not typical of female patterns found in earlier studies. Females tend to show little or no activation in this particular part of the brain.
Listen, you guys heard this research. Wouldn't you love to know how your brain reacts to these images? And don't you want to climb into that scanner? Curious? Well, so was I. So I got Dr. Hammond's permission to get into the scanner myself, and here's what happened.
I've just had the first MRI of my life. And now I'm about to broadcast my sexual arousal patterns on national TV. I hope my wife forgives me.
That's what we typically see when someone is thinking very intensely about something.
Yeah, this is all my wife understands. It's not my fault, just my brain. I told you. I was so delighted when we were looking at the scans and Dr. Hammond's initial response was, whoa, goodness. Who knew? And also, the threat response that all the men were getting when they looked at images of other men, I was not aware of anything. In terms of subconsciously experienced nothing. So these things are very, very primitive, and as you see, very substantial and very important.
So I hope you enjoy that. What I thought was interesting was that we were able to show that this one female, I don't know if you caught it, she actually didn't have the female typical response. And I think that just highlights the idea that what we're looking at are group level activities. You're always going to find some individuals in whatever group who don't necessarily, their activity doesn't fit with everybody else. And the very end, one thing we didn't report in the study in Nature Neuroscience that we did put into this Discovery Health clip was this finding that when males look at other males who are nude, there's a strong threat, what we call a threat response in the amygdala bilaterally. They rate it very low in terms of arousal, but actually what was kind of interesting was that even though they weren't aware of this feeling, it was one of the strongest effects. So next one. I'll just jump through the experimental design because I think they already went through that. So the two areas that we were particularly interested in that I think you could get from that was the amygdala and also the hypothalamus, which has a strong sexually dimorphic role in these activities. And just to kind of very quickly go through here. So what we're doing here is we were comparing 14 males and 14 females. And we had this comparison where we had a man and woman in an arousing situation versus man and woman interacting but neutrally. And so a typical kind of fMRI subtraction approach. And then what we wanted to do was see where were those activations to the sexually attractive stimuli stronger in the males. And it's not all over the brain. It was really only in these areas which we had an a priori idea from the rat literature and from one or two other fMRI studies before that. So we found that was really striking. But I think one thing that we often overlook is the commonality. So these are the areas that are actually the same between males and females. So in fact, if I had to give a percentage value, it's more than 90% of the areas in the brain were acting very similarly for the women and the men when they were looking at these stimuli. So it's really sort of depending on whether you look at a glass half full or half empty. And those areas were involved in attention and, the ventral striatum as well as very strongly activated. So not surprisingly, they both found them arousing and appetitive. So let me, in my last few minutes, kind of come back to, again, those three organizing ideas. So what is the value of understanding this? Well, it's important to understand reproduction and differences between men and women. And I think the fact that we found specific differences rather than what you might have expected would be just all over the brain, there would be all sorts of differences. Sometimes you see that, but in this case, it was much more specific. And I think that's more informative because we can then say that perhaps something that we already know about the specific function of those regions, the hypothalamus and the amygdala, could give us clues to what the nature of the sex difference is in processing. However, do we risk reinforcing sexual stereotypes in this kind of studies? I mean, maybe the idea is that, well, you can't help it, right? I think there was kind of an allusion to that. It's my brain is making me do it. Ben Roethlisberger, I mean, maybe he could have this defense, I don't know. I think he's completely innocent, they said, but who knows? But we do risk the appearance of reducing complex behavior to a few brain areas, immutable and intrinsic activity. So I think when people see these there actually have been studies where people put the same exact study and it has a brain image or doesn't have a brain image, and people have a much stronger feeling that it's an immutable characteristic or that it's real. So we can predict the neural responses at the group level, but as you can see, there's always one or two subjects who are quite different. What does that mean? Is that important? I think it is. We just don't understand it well enough. It could be statistical noise. Now, we've just completed a follow-up study. I can't really say very much about it, except to say that it is in men who actually appear female, sometimes marry, but they have complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. So, in other words, they have the genetic XY makeup, but when they develop, they don't have the ability to have their tissues be affected by androgens. So what we found, and we're doing all sorts of structural and other kinds of changes, but what we predicted was that based on our previous research that we would find differences in those areas, and so far it has been, especially in the amygdala on the right, seems like there's the females who we've tested and these CIAS females who are actually XY males, they perform similarly and they're both different from the males. So that's an example of being able to predict from these previous studies what we would find. Now, we haven't used this for this purpose, but if you look in the literature, there are studies that have done, for example, especially in Germany, there's several studies where they're looking at the brain response to underage children, and it does, in the amygdala and some other areas, it does have differential activity between those people who don't have a response to it or who do behaviorally. And there's also some work by Michael Bailey in terms of being able to use a discriminant function to figure out someone's sexual orientation from their brain. But I also read you can figure out from the Facebook friends at a 70% probability, so that's have we really come that far. And finally, the privacy concerns really are paramount because, I mean, in this case, Dr. Drew knew that we were going to be analyzing his functional data in that way. But what if we could start looking at some of the structural differences and maybe someone had scans acquired for a completely different purpose, and then we were able to then prognosticate about something about their sexual behavior? I think that raises some major issues. So in terms of control, there's ideas that we can use some of these related studies for pain control, and these areas might be targets for drugs to treat hypoarousal. But could be risking the unintended consequences of being able to increase sexual motivation. So I think for each of these issues, you could see two sides of the coin. All right, I'm just about done. So I want to leave you with some broad questions. Hopefully we can pick this up in the discussion after Dr. Farah's talk. So what is really the scope of the questions that we should be able to address with fMRI? Is nothing sacred in the sense? I mean, could we really look at anything? Or are we too queasy about things? Are there some things that are better left alone? Like racial differences, for example. How can we avoid these common pitfalls? It's not like these are new. You'll see these over and over again. So I think we really have to do a better job of getting the information, when it's a good study, out to the public without falling prey to some of these biases which can happen along the way. And if we decide that there are some problematic uses of fMRI, just as with, like, say, stem cell research, is it even possible to regulate it? Can we really do anything about it? And I just want to acknowledge my collaborators, Kim Wallen here, and his lab, Jennifer Wilson, who's here in the audience, and for the politics study, Drew Weston, Pavel Blagov, Kiltz, and Keith Horensky, and also our funding sources. Thanks.
told these second graders, when you have emotions, it's in your brain. Afterwards, she was taken aside by the teacher of the class who said, you can't say that. Emotions come from the heart. Now, I thought that was a metaphorical sort of thing. It ends up it's not. There's a wonderful book called The Soul Made Flesh by Daniel Zimmer. It's about the history of neuroscience, especially William Gross, back in the medieval times. And there's Aristotle. It was Aristotle where the emotions came from the heart. And that, someone gets a big heart and they flow up. And they didn't have discovered the flow of blood yet. Heartbeat didn't come along. So they thought emotions flowed up through the vascular system into the ventricles of the brain. But it came from the heart. Now, the reason I mention this is that we may here be talking about the fine details of all this. But actually, out there in the broader society, there's a huge disconnect between the scientific group who says very readily, oh, our thoughts, our feelings, our hopes, they all rest in this bit of tissue in our skull. That is very threatening to many, many people. Thanks.
This is actually just a follow-up on the point that was made just now. Notice that the narrator of the clip said at the end said it's not my fault, it's just my brain, which reinforces that point. Paul Bloom put this very nicely in a panel on mind in the media that I put together a while back. He's a psychologist, and he said when you show this sort of information to the public, when you show it in scientists or people who understand the nature of fMRI and the, let's say, physicalists about the way mind works, they see this data and they say, oh, that's where it happens in the brain. So, all not very surprising. Of course, the individual is involved in sex. But when the public sees it, they say, you mean the brain does that too?
Yeah.
This feeling that it conflicts with this sort of both dualism idea. And it's worrisome to the extent that people then think, it's not my fault, it's my brain that's doing it, and they continue to see these.
Well, I would agree with both of you. I think there's a long way to go in terms of public science education, and I think that we often assume that people out there are having the same sorts of concepts or have the same kind of background about either science or even politics or knowing geography, for example. And so I think that it's very challenging because we have to somehow raise the tide everywhere. But I think what we can do is try, at least through these media outlets, to try to at least get in some of these ideas. It's hard in the age of sound bites. So I think it's going to take a while to change these sorts of issues.
Hi there.
Hi.
I was actually thinking that your connection in your talk and your title between sex and politics, that we were going to hopefully see some brain images of suffragettes and, to gain the right to vote, what would have been going on in their brains. So sorry, that
That would have been great.
where this talk is going to go. But my question is, working within a heteronormative framework that you are, I'm just wondering if part of the neuroethics part of this is thinking of what your work and the message that's being sent out there, what kind of message that's sending to people who don't identify within that heteronormative framework. I mean, there was a few comments embedded in the clips that you showed
Right.
that hinted towards, masculine behaviors and men looking at images of men and images of threat or response to threat. So I'm just wondering, what's the kind of broader impact to people who don't identify within this kind of gender or sex binary?
Right. Well, I think that's really, so our research really hasn't focused on that, but subsequent to that, there's been a lot of studies in a lot of different populations of functional connectivity, structural differences, people, transsexuals, different orientations. And I think I always try to be very careful to limit our conclusions, but also to put them in a neutral framework, as they're value neutral in that sense. When we start to interact with the media and with a television show, there's always this, again, a bias to try to make it interesting. But I think in terms of that particular threat response, that's been shown in some other studies as well. And I think what I liked was actually Dr. Drew was putting it in a very sort of neutral way. He said, I wasn't even aware. He said earlier in the show that he was completely sort of fine with everything, but he didn't realize that he had this response. Now, whether that actually means that he has some sort of belief or some sort of response that he's not aware of. I mean, I think we really need, so you've got a very good point. We haven't followed that up and to show, well, maybe it's just something completely that we just didn't understand, or maybe it's something that it's very salient because the brain area we looked at, the amygdala, it also sort of tracks other things in other contexts. So maybe it could be an intruder or something would be a competitor. So it could be a sexual competitor, for example. So I think the particular interpretation we had there was probably going a little too far in terms of its specificity, right?